I buried my husband 5 years ago in a closed casket. I paid for the funeral, I wept at his grave, and I spent years rebuilding my shattered life for the sake of our son. I was 34 years old, a woman completely devoted to her child and her work. But everything I believed about my past was a lie. It started as we sat in the first-class cabin on a flight to Marthas Vineyard. We were heading to the annual family retreat. My 12-year-old son Jamal dropped his ginger ale. The plastic cup shattered against the floor, spilling liquid everywhere. He tugged at my sleeve, his face completely drained of color. He whispered that I needed to turn around right now because his father was sitting 2 rows behind us. I turned my head slowly, expecting a cruel resemblance or a trick of the light. Instead, my blood turned to ice. Sitting in seat 4A was the ghost of my past. He was wearing a tailored suit and dark sunglasses, but the small scar on his chin was unmistakable. It was Marcus. My supposedly dead husband was sitting there laughing and sipping champagne, and the betrayal cut even deeper when I saw who was sitting right next to him. My younger sister Chloe was clinking her glass against his. Beside her sat her husband Preston, the wealthy white heir my parents practically worshipped. They were all talking and sharing a drink like old friends. I stood up and walked down the narrow aisle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached out and snatched the sunglasses right off his face. Marcus froze. His eyes widened in absolute shock. Chloe immediately slapped my hand away, spilling her drink all over her designer dress. She glared at me and raised her voice so the entire cabin could hear. She asked if I was off my medication again. She told me to stop embarrassing the family and introduced the man as Julian. She claimed he was Preston's European investment partner. Preston just smirked and told me to sit down before I caused a scene in front of his business colleagues. They were gaslighting me right to my face. I looked into the eyes of the man I had married, and he just stared back with a blank expression, pretending he had never seen me before in his life. I grabbed Jamal by the hand and went back to my seat. I did not scream or cry. I just sat there plotting my next move while they continued to laugh behind me. I knew I had to be smart. The moment the plane touched down on the tarmac, the real nightmare began. My parents, Vivian and Desmond, were waiting for us near the private hangar. They are the definition of high society elites in Atlanta. Everything they do is about maintaining their prestigious country club image. I walked down the stairs and immediately told my mother that Marcus was on the plane. I expected her to gasp or call security. Instead, her face twisted with pure rage. Vivian grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into my skin. She dragged me away from the other passengers and told me to shut my mouth. She hissed that I was trying to humiliate the family in front of Preston's old money relatives again. She reminded me that I had been unstable ever since I dropped out of law school to peddle cheap houses. She threatened to commit me to a psychiatric ward if I said another word about a dead man. I stared at my parents' cold and unbothered faces. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They already knew. My entire family had been hiding my dead husband for half a decade. Before I could fully process the massive betrayal, Preston stepped forward and snapped his fingers. 2 massive bodyguards moved toward Jamal. Preston smiled, his arrogant white privilege fully on display. He announced that since his sister-in-law was clearly having a psychotic break, he was taking temporary protective custody of his nephew. My mother actually nodded in agreement, saying it was for the best until I got my head straight. They were trying to steal my son right in front of me. They expected me to break down and beg. They expected the fragile college dropout they had spent years looking down on. I just smiled. I tapped the face of my smartwatch. Instantly, 4 baggage handlers dropped their luggage and sprinted toward us. They were not airport staff. They were undercover private military contractors I had hired weeks ago. My team tackled Preston's massive bodyguards, driving them hard into the concrete tarmac. Preston stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. Vivian screamed and covered her mouth. Desmond stepped back in fear. I stepped right into Preston's personal space, backing him up against the side of the plane. I asked him if he really thought I would bring my son to an isolated island with a pack of vultures without securing a private detail first. I watched his arrogance crumble into pure terror. I then turned my attention back to the ghost. Marcus was standing near the stairs trying to look like an innocent bystander named Julian. I walked up to him and leaned in close. I took a deep breath and looked him dead in the eyes. I told him that Julian would never be caught dead wearing that cheap sandalwood cologne I bought for our 3rd anniversary. Marcus swallowed hard and broke eye contact, his entire facade failing. I took Jamal's hand and turned my back on the people who shared my blood. My contractors escorted us to a pre-booked armored Cadillac waiting beyond the gate. I left them standing on the runway in absolute stunned silence. They thought they trapped a widow. They had no idea they declared war on a woman who owned the battlefield. The armored Cadillac door slammed shut, sealing us inside. My heart pounded, but I forced my breathing to slow. Jamal sat beside me, staring at his trembling hands. I lifted his chin. I told him he was brave and did perfectly. I promised fiercely no one would ever take him from me, regardless of their wealth or power. He asked if that man was really his father. I nodded and told him the truth. I explained the man he saw smiling on that airplane was supposed to be resting inside the casket we buried 5 years ago. He deserved facts. The drive to the safe house took 20 minutes. We pulled up to a stunning glass and steel home hidden on a cliffside overlooking the crashing ocean. My family thought I was renting a cheap rundown motel. They had no idea I actually owned this luxurious property and the 3 massive estates surrounding it. We walked inside and I went straight to the master bedroom. Behind a large abstract painting was a hidden biometric wall safe. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and the steel door clicked open instantly. Inside the vault were legal files, banking tokens, and encrypted hard drives. I sat down on the mattress edge and pulled out a thick red folder. I looked at Jamal and told him a dark story I had kept buried for 3 years. 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in my apartment going through old tax documents. I stumbled across a bizarre digital footprint hidden deep in the paperwork. I found strange offshore wire transfers linked directly to the $5 million life insurance payout from his father's tragic death. The money was supposed to be locked in a trust for Jamal's education, but someone was siphoning it piece by piece. I spent months hiring private investigators to track the breadcrumbs across the globe. They led straight to a luxury villa in Europe. That day, I realized my husband faked his death to run away. I did not go to the police right away. I did not scream or confront my parents about the ultimate betrayal. I knew if I showed my hand early, they would crush me using their massive wealth and high society connections. Instead, I played the pathetic part they forcefully assigned me. I played the broken, depressed dropout widow who needed their charity. I let them sneer at me during elegant Thanksgiving dinners. I let them mock my cheap clothes and my small business. While they laughed cruelly at my misery, I worked harder than ever before. I took my real estate business and turned it into a ruthless luxury development empire. I mastered the world of offshore banking. I spent 3 years building an impenetrable financial fortress and transferring every asset I owned into it. Suddenly my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was an urgent group text from my father Desmond. The message was cold and direct. It said there was a mandatory family meeting at the main estate tonight. If I did not show up immediately, they were filing an emergency court order to take full legal custody of Jamal, based on my supposedly deteriorating mental health. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was terrified, poor, and alone. I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the bed. I grabbed a small encrypted flash drive from the safe, slipping it into my designer clutch. I walked over to the mirror and applied a fresh coat of blood-red lipstick. I turned to my security chief, telling him to secure the perimeter and keep Jamal safe. I looked at my reflection one last time, whispering it was time to burn down their country club. 30 minutes later, my driver pulled up to my parents' sprawling $20 million estate. The massive mahogany front doors were already unlocked. I walked straight into the lion's den without knocking. The atmosphere in the grand study was suffocating and tense. My father, Desmond, stood behind his massive desk, gripping a crystal glass of expensive whiskey. My mother Vivian sat on the leather sofa glaring at me with absolute disgust. Beside her sat my sister Chloe adjusting her diamond bracelets with a smug, arrogant smile. Preston stood leaning casually against the bookshelf looking incredibly proud of himself, and hiding quietly in the shadows near the large bay window was Marcus, the ghost himself. No one bothered to offer me a seat. Desmond slammed a thick legal document onto the desk without offering a single greeting. He told me that tomorrow morning, a local judge was going to officially declare me mentally unfit to care for myself or my child. He announced that Preston would be stepping in immediately as my permanent legal conservator. They were planning to completely take over my real estate company under the guise of protecting Jamal's future. Chloe laughed out loud, taking a slow sip of her martini. She told me not to worry about my little business. She promised she would take the pennies from those cheap little condos I built and use them to buy herself a new designer handbag. She sneered, saying this was exactly the outcome I deserved for refusing to marry the wealthy elite men our mother picked out for me years ago. She called me a disgrace to our elite lineage. Preston pulled his phone out of his pocket and stared at the bright screen. A wicked, satisfied grin spread across his pale face. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered what he truly thought was the final killing blow. He announced that my bank accounts had been frozen exactly 2 minutes ago. He laughed mockingly and told me I was completely penniless. The entire room stared at me eagerly, waiting for me to fall to my knees and beg for mercy. They waited for the broken widow to finally shatter into pieces. I just simply smiled. The heavy doors of the armored Cadillac sealed shut with a comforting thud. I instructed the driver to take the scenic coastal route, giving us a moment to breathe. Jamal sat beside me, his eyes wide with 100 unspoken questions. I pulled him close, burying my face in his hair, and told him how incredibly brave he had been today. I promised him that no one would ever take him from me, no matter how much money or influence they possessed. He looked up at me and asked if that man was really his father. I nodded slowly. I explained that the man laughing on the airplane was indeed the same man we were supposed to have buried 5 years ago. I knew he deserved the truth, even the ugly parts. We arrived at our destination 20 minutes later. My family assumed I would be staying at some cheap budget motel on the edge of the island. They had absolutely no idea that I actually owned the breathtaking cliffside property we just pulled into. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture with massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic. It was a secluded fortress designed for absolute privacy. I ushered Jamal inside past the security detail I had stationed at the perimeter. I walked straight into the master bedroom and approached a large abstract painting hanging on the far wall. I swung the canvas aside to reveal a hidden biometric safe. I pressed my thumb against the glowing scanner, and the heavy steel door clicked open instantly. I reached inside and pulled out a thick red folder stuffed with banking documents and legal files. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and called Jamal over. I needed him to understand why his mother had acted like a broken shadow for the past few years. I told him a story that I had kept buried deep inside my chest. 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in our cramped apartment, sorting through old tax returns and financial statements. I accidentally stumbled across a bizarre digital footprint hidden beneath layers of shell companies. I found a series of strange offshore wire transfers linked directly to the $5 million life insurance payout from his father's tragic boating accident. That money was supposed to be locked in an untouchable trust for Jamal's college education. But someone had been siphoning it out piece by piece, routing it through banks in Europe. I spent the next 6 months hiring the best forensic accountants and private investigators I could find. They followed the money trail across the globe. The breadcrumbs led straight to a luxury villa in the south of France. That was the day I realized my husband had not drowned at sea. He had faked his own death to run away with millions. The betrayal cut so deep it felt like I was bleeding out, but I did not go to the police. I did not confront my high society parents or my arrogant sister. I knew exactly how the black elite of Atlanta operated. If I showed my hand too early, they would use their country club connections and massive wealth to crush me and take my son. So I played the exact part they forcefully assigned to me. I played the pathetic, depressed law school dropout who could barely keep her life together. I let them sneer at me during elegant Thanksgiving dinners. I let my sister Chloe mock my cheap clothes while she paraded around in designer gowns. I let my brother-in-law Preston patronize me with his old money white privilege. But while they were busy laughing at my misery, I was working harder than anyone could possibly imagine. I took my tiny real estate business and quietly transformed it into a ruthless luxury development empire. I mastered the complicated world of offshore banking and corporate acquisitions. I spent 3 long years building an absolute financial fortress, and I legally transferred every single asset I owned into it. I became a ghost in the financial world preparing for this exact moment. Suddenly, the sharp buzz of my phone broke the silence in the room. I picked it up and saw an urgent group text from my father Desmond. The message was cold, calculated, and direct. It demanded my presence at a mandatory family meeting at their main estate tonight. The second sentence was a blatant threat. My father wrote that if I did not show up immediately, they were going to file an emergency court order first thing in the morning to take full legal custody of Jamal. They planned to claim that I was suffering from a severe psychotic break and was unfit to be a mother. They really thought they had backed me into a corner. They truly believed I was still the terrified poor and alone widow they had been manipulating for half a decade. I locked my phone screen and tossed it onto the plush duvet. I reached back into the open safe and grabbed a small encrypted flash drive. It contained every piece of explosive evidence I had gathered over the years. I slipped the drive into my designer clutch. I walked over to the vanity mirror and carefully applied a fresh coat of blood-red lipstick. I stared at my reflection, watching the transformation from a grieving widow into a woman ready for war. I turned to my security chief, who was standing by the bedroom door. I instructed him to secure the entire perimeter and keep my son out of sight until I returned. I looked back at the mirror one last time and whispered to myself that it was finally time to burn down their precious country club. My private driver pulled up to my parents' sprawling $20 million estate 30 minutes later. The massive mahogany front doors were already unlocked, a clear sign they were eagerly waiting for their prey. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the grand marble staircase of the estate. The towering white columns of the $20 million mansion loomed over me, casting long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. I pushed the heavy double doors open, and the silence inside the house was completely deafening. My designer heels clicked sharply against the imported Italian tile as I made my slow, deliberate way down the long corridor toward my father's private study. I knew exactly what awaited me inside those walls. I pushed the doors open and stepped right into the lion's den. The atmosphere in the room was thick with arrogance and suffocating privilege. My father Desmond stood behind his massive oak desk. He looked down his nose at me, projecting the ultimate authority of a man accustomed to buying his way out of any problem. My mother Vivian was perched on a tufted leather sofa across the room. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure disgust and absolute contempt. Beside her sat my sister Chloe, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelets with a smug, arrogant smile playing on her lips. Preston stood leaning casually against the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, looking incredibly proud of himself. And hiding quietly in the shadowed corner near the large bay window was Marcus. The ghost himself was standing right there in my parents' home, sipping a glass of expensive bourbon as if he had never left us. No one bothered to offer me a seat. No one asked how my son was doing. They simply stared at me like a nuisance they were finally about to exterminate. I stood my ground in the center of the room, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Desmond did not waste any time with pleasantries. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal document. He slammed the papers down onto the mahogany desk with a loud, aggressive crack that echoed through the quiet study. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered his opening strike. He told me that tomorrow morning, a highly respected local judge was going to officially declare me mentally unfit to care for myself or my child. He announced that Preston would be stepping in immediately as my permanent legal conservator. I stared at the forged documents, immediately recognizing the signature of a corrupt family court judge who frequently golfed with my father at the country club. Desmond explained their master plan with terrifying calmness. They were planning to completely take over my real estate company under the guise of protecting Jamal's future. My father claimed that my completely justified behavior at the airport proved I was having a severe psychotic break and needed immediate institutionalization. He said it was a tragic but necessary measure to preserve the family legacy and protect their reputation. He actually expected me to break down and beg for mercy. He expected me to fall to my knees and plead for my freedom in front of them. I just stared at the pathetic piece of paper and asked if this was really the best strategy they could come up with. Chloe laughed out loud at my response. She took a slow sip of her dirty martini, the ice clinking loudly in the crystal glass. She stood up and slowly walked over to me, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. She told me not to worry about my little business. She promised she would take the pennies from those cheap little condos I built and use them to buy herself a brand new designer handbag. The jealousy practically dripped from her voice. She had always hated that I refused to play the traditional high society game. She sneered and told me this was exactly the outcome I deserved for refusing to marry the wealthy elite men our mother picked out for me years ago. She reminded me of the powerful corporate lawyer I had rejected to marry Marcus, resulting in my so-called miserable life. Chloe called me a complete disgrace to our elite lineage. She said I was a dark stain on the family name, and it was time for the adults to take out the trash. She boasted about how Preston was going to liquidate my entire portfolio and use the cash to fund their lavish lifestyle. She actually thought my business consisted of a few run-down apartment buildings. She had absolutely no idea that my commercial properties spanned 3 major cities and generated more revenue in a single quarter than her husband had seen in his entire lifetime. I let her continue her pathetic monologue, absorbing every single bitter word without flinching or breaking eye contact. Preston finally stepped away from the bookshelf. He walked over and stood right next to his wife, wrapping a protective arm around her waist to present a united front. He pulled his latest smartphone out of his pocket and stared at the bright screen. A wicked, satisfied grin spread across his pale face as he read the notification. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered what he truly believed was the final killing blow. He announced that the corrupt judge had just expedited the emergency order. Preston tapped the screen of his phone and stated proudly that my bank accounts had been frozen exactly 2 minutes ago. He laughed mockingly and told me that I was completely penniless. He said I did not have a single dollar left to hire a lawyer to fight the conservatorship or protect my son. He told me I was trapped with nowhere to run. The entire room stared at me eagerly, waiting for my spirit to finally shatter into pieces. They waited for the broken widow to cry out in absolute and complete despair. I looked directly at their greedy, expectant faces, and I just simply smiled back at them. I let the silence stretch out in the study, allowing them to savor their false victory for just a few seconds longer. They were all staring at me, waiting for the tears to fall. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me break under the weight of their cruelty. They expected the fragile woman they had bullied for years to finally surrender. Instead, I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the antique crystal bar cart, resting in the corner of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured myself a neat glass of my father's most expensive aged bourbon. The amber liquid splashed loudly into the glass, echoing through the suffocating quiet of the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the burn coat my throat before I finally turned back to face my executioners. I looked directly at Preston, who was still holding his phone with that smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. The bank accounts under the personal name Nia Williams were indeed frozen. I raised my glass to him and congratulated him on successfully seizing exactly $247.12. His grin faltered instantly. His eyebrows pulled together in sudden confusion as the math failed to align with his grand expectations. I took another sip of bourbon and casually explained that my real estate company had not been in my personal name for 3 long years. I walked across the plush Persian rug, closing the distance between us with measured, confident steps. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal dossier. I dropped the massive stack of papers right onto Preston's lap. The heavy thud made him flinch physically. I watched his eyes dart down to the international banking seals stamped on the front cover of the documents. I told him in a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice that 100% of my assets were transferred into an offshore blind trust located in Switzerland the exact same day I realized my husband had faked his own death. I leaned in close enough to see the sweat beginning to bead on his pale forehead. I whispered that his bought and paid for local family court judge had absolutely zero jurisdiction over international wealth management. The conservatorship order he just threatened me with was nothing but a completely useless piece of paper. He could not touch a single brick of my properties or a single penny of my revenue. All the color rapidly drained from Preston's face. He looked like he had just seen a ghost, and ironically, the actual ghost was hiding right there in the corner of the room. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but he could not find his voice. His hands began to shake as he flipped through the airtight Swiss legal documents, confirming his absolute failure. I did not give him a chance to recover or spin another lie. I turned to address the entire room, exposing the dark, ugly truth they had all been too blind or too arrogant to see. I told them exactly why Preston was so desperate to steal my company today. I looked at my sister Chloe, who was suddenly gripping her martini glass so tightly her knuckles were turning white. I announced that her perfect husband did not want my business to protect my son. He needed my liquid assets to inject emergency cash into the massive Ponzi scheme he had the absolute nerve to call a hedge fund. Preston tried to stand up, but I put my hand firmly on his shoulder and shoved him back down into his seat. I told the room that Preston's precious old money-white family was completely broke. They had been bankrupt for years, coasting on nothing but a famous last name and massive country club credit lines. I looked at my father Desmond, who was clutching the edge of his mahogany desk. I revealed that Preston had been bleeding my parents dry to cover his massive financial crimes. Every single investment my father thought he was making into prestigious commercial properties was actually just paying off Preston's angry investors. He had completely drained my parents' retirement accounts, and he needed to steal my empire just to keep himself out of a federal prison cell. Chloe gasped, dropping her drink onto the floor. The glass shattered, but no one moved. She looked at her husband, begging him to deny it. She begged Preston to tell me I was lying, but Preston just stared at the dossier in his lap, entirely defeated. The facade of the wealthy, elite white savior had completely shattered into dust. He was nothing but a desperate thief who had used a wealthy black family as his personal piggy bank. Marcus stepped out from the shadows, looking panicked, realizing his own $1 million payday was evaporating right in front of him. But the most violent reaction did not come from Preston or Chloe or even my father. It came from my mother. Vivian could not handle the devastating truth. Her entire identity, her entire social standing among the black elite of Atlanta was built on the foundation of having a daughter married into old money royalty. She refused to accept that her ultimate prize was actually a parasite draining her dry. Vivian marched across the room, her face contorted with blind, furious denial. Before I could even brace myself, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly against the wood-paneled walls. My head snapped to the side, my cheek burning fiercely from the impact of her heavy diamond rings. Vivian stood there with her chest heaving, pointing a trembling finger right in my face. She screamed, asking how dare I insult Preston's heritage. She shouted that his family was royalty, and that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter dropout, making up elaborate lies to destroy her perfect household. She demanded that I apologize to him right that very second. My cheek burned from the force of my mother's strike, but I did not raise my hand to touch it. I did not step back. I just stood there, letting the stinging silence stretch across the study. Vivian was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me, waiting for me to break down and apologize to the white man who was actively robbing her blind. She was so deeply brainwashed by the allure of high society and old money that she was willing to strike her own flesh and blood just to protect a parasite. I looked at my mother and told her she was a pathetic woman who loved a country club membership more than her own children. Before Vivian could raise her hand to strike me again, a heavy footstep echoed against the hardwood floor. Marcus stepped completely out of the shadows. He walked right past my parents and moved toward me. The ridiculous European posture he had been faking all day completely vanished. When he opened his mouth, the fake sophisticated accent was entirely gone, replaced by the harsh, familiar tone I had listened to for years of our marriage. He told my mother to back away. He stepped right up to me, using his height to try and intimidate me the way he used to when we argued behind closed doors. He thought because he was a man, and I was the wife he had abandoned, that he still possessed some kind of physical and psychological authority over me. He backed me up slightly toward the edge of the mahogany desk, looking incredibly menacing. His eyes were dark and desperate. He told me the games were officially over. He demanded that I hand over the access codes to the Swiss Blind Trust right now. He said if I transferred the $5 million back into an account he controlled, he would take Chloe and leave the country quietly, without ruining my reputation. I stared up at the man I had once loved, the man I had mourned until my soul felt entirely hollow. I asked him what made him think he had any right to make demands in a room where he was nothing but a resurrected corpse. Marcus smirked and reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded manila envelope and tossed it onto the desk right next to Preston's useless conservatorship papers. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the cheap cologne mingling with his nervous sweat. He told me that envelope contained a highly detailed, privately commissioned forensics report. He claimed it proved the fuel lines on his yacht had been intentionally severed before he took it out on the water 5 years ago. He leaned in closer and whispered that he was going to walk straight into the local police precinct and tell the authorities that his greedy wife tried to murder him for the life insurance payout. He threatened to claim that he had to fake his own death and hide for 5 years just to escape my violent, psychotic behavior. Chloe stepped up to stand right beside him, slipping her arm through his with absolute confidence. The betrayal of seeing my own sister holding on to my husband did not even sting anymore. It just fueled the fire burning inside me. Chloe looked at me with a vicious, mocking smirk. She told me I should listen to him and hand over the money. She tilted her head and asked me how I thought a jury would view this situation. She laid out the narrative they planned to sell to the media. She said the press would paint me as a mentally unstable black woman who murdered her successful husband just to get her hands on his wealth. She laughed a cold, cruel sound and pointed out that with my history of dropping out of law school and my recent supposed mental breakdown, the jury would eat the story up without a second thought. She proudly declared that I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison while they spent my hard-earned money on the French Riviera. They really thought they had me trapped. They thought the threat of prison and public ruin would force me to surrender everything I had built. They stood there completely united in their monstrous delusion, waiting for me to panic. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Chloe. And then I started to laugh. It was not a small, polite chuckle. It was a loud, genuine, hysterical laugh that bubbled up from the deepest part of my chest. The sound echoed off the high ceilings of the study, completely shattering the tense atmosphere they had tried so hard to construct. My mother looked at me like I had actually lost my mind. Preston's jaw dropped. Marcus frowned, his confident posture slipping as he tried to figure out why his ultimate threat was being treated like a hilarious joke. I stopped laughing, but kept the wide smile on my face. I took one step forward, completely closing the distance until I was mere inches from Marcus' face. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my gaze. I looked straight into his panicked eyes and spoke with absolute crystal-clear authority. I told him to do it. I told him to march right down to the police station and hand them that fabricated report. I encouraged him to tell the detectives his wild little story about the murderous wife. Marcus swallowed hard, totally thrown off balance by my complete lack of fear. I tilted my head and kept my voice dangerously soft. I told him that when he sends that report to the cops, he needs to make absolutely sure to copy them on the email I prepared. I whispered that he definitely wanted the authorities to see the high-definition video I recovered from the yacht's hidden security dashcam. I watched the color completely drain from both Marcus and Chloe's faces in perfect synchronization. They stopped breathing. The smug, arrogant smiles they had been wearing just moments ago melted away into pure, unadulterated terror. I let the silence hang in the air, allowing the gravity of my words to crush whatever hope they had left. I reminded Marcus that when you buy a luxury yacht using marital funds, you should always check if your wife installed a secondary surveillance system for insurance purposes. I told them that hidden camera captured every single moment on that deck. It captured the real reason the boat sank. It captured the exact timeline of their disgusting betrayal. They thought the ocean had swallowed their secrets forever. They had no idea I had dredged them up 3 years ago and had been holding on to them waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I reached into the sleek interior of my designer clutch, and my fingers wrapped around the cold metal of my tablet. The room was absolutely silent. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the thick Persian rug. Marcus was breathing heavily, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he was calculating his chances of outrunning my private security team. Chloe stood perfectly still, her manicured hands trembling slightly. I pulled the tablet out and tapped the screen, waking it from sleep mode. I did not rush. I let the anticipations stretch out and suffocate them. I swiped my finger across the glass and opened the video file I had kept safely encrypted for 3 long years. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The crisp, high-definition audio immediately filled the grand study. The sound of ocean waves crashing against a fiberglass hull echoed off the mahogany bookshelves. Then came the unmistakable sound of a woman laughing. It was a breathless, eager laugh. I turned the screen around so everyone in the room could see it clearly. The footage was completely undeniable. It showed the rear deck of the luxury yacht Marcus had purchased with our joint savings. The bright sunlight illuminated the scene perfectly. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the video proved the exact date and time. It was exactly 5 minutes before the vessel allegedly experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure and sank to the bottom of the ocean. The video showed Marcus leaning against the railing, looking completely relaxed and entirely alive. And there, right beside him, with her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, was my perfect golden child sister. The camera captured them pulling each other close and engaging in a passionate, aggressive kiss. The audio picked up their conversation with terrifying clarity. The entire room heard Marcus tell Chloe that the explosive charges were set in the engine room. They heard Chloe giggle and say that her pathetic dropout sister would spend the next 10 years crying over an empty grave while they spent $5 million on a private beach in Monaco. The reaction in the study was instantaneous and violent. Chloe gasped so sharply she choked on her own breath. Her fingers went entirely numb. The crystal martini glass slipped from her grasp and plummeted to the floor. It shattered into a dozen jagged pieces, sending cold gin and olive juice splashing across my mother's priceless antique rug. Chloe did not even look down at the mess. Her eyes were glued to the glowing screen of the tablet, watching her own vile betrayal broadcast in high definition. She raised her hands to her face, shaking uncontrollably as the digital version of herself continued to kiss my husband. I shifted my gaze away from my sister and focused entirely on Preston. The transformation taking place on his face was a masterpiece of psychological destruction. The arrogant, entitled white privilege that usually dripped from his every word completely evaporated. The smug mask of old money superiority melted away, leaving behind a man who had just realized he was the biggest joke in Atlanta. The color violently rushed to his cheeks, turning his pale skin a deep, mottled crimson. A thick vein throbbed aggressively against the collar of his expensive tailored shirt, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He had spent years looking down on me and treating my family like his personal piggy bank. Now he had to stand there and watch his gorgeous trophy wife treating him like an absolute fool. I tapped the screen to pause the video, leaving the image frozen on Marcus and Chloe's tangled embrace. I smiled a slow, dangerous smile that made my mother physically recoil. I looked right at Preston and broke the silence. I told him that Marcus did not fake his death to escape his mounting business debts. That was just the convenient lie he planned to feed the police if he ever got caught. I explained the ugly truth. He faked his tragic demise to run away with $5 million in stolen life insurance and the precious golden child of the family. He wanted the perfect sister. He wanted the woman my parents worshipped. Chloe finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic squeak. She stepped toward her husband, reaching her trembling hands out to him. She started stammering and crying, begging Preston to listen to her. She swore that it meant nothing. She claimed Marcus had manipulated her, and that she only loved Preston. It was the most desperate, pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. She was completely terrified of losing her status. She knew that without Preston's fake aristocratic name, she was just a fraud. She needed his white elite validation to survive in her superficial country club world. Marcus tried to backpedal too. He raised his hands defensively and took a step away from Chloe, trying to physically distance himself from the wreckage. He looked at my father and started babbling, making up wild excuses about how things got out of control. He was a coward who refused to take accountability for his own actions. But no one was listening to his pathetic lies. The air in the room had grown dangerously thin. Preston completely snapped. The humiliation was too much for his fragile ego to process. He let out a raw, guttural scream that sounded like a wounded animal. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, completely ignoring me and Marcus. He went straight for his wife. Preston tackled Chloe, driving her back against the heavy wooden bookshelf. Hardcover books tumbled to the floor as he wrapped his large hands directly around her neck. Chloe shrieked in terror, clawing frantically at his wrists as he squeezed tighter. The pristine elite family facade instantly descended into a violent screaming brawl. Desmond shouted for Preston to stop and threw himself at his son-in-law, trying to pry his thick fingers off Chloe's throat. Vivian shrieked at the top of her lungs, beating her fists against Preston's back to save her favorite child. Marcus tried to intervene, but Preston wildly swung a fist backward, catching Marcus square in the jaw and sending him crashing into the coffee table. The perfect high society family was literally tearing each other apart like wild animals. I just stood there perfectly still, holding my tablet and watching them destroy themselves. Preston's fingers dug into Chloe's neck. The heavy mahogany bookshelves rattled as her back slammed against them again. The pristine high society facade of my family completely evaporated into absolute chaos. I stood perfectly still, holding my tablet, as the room descended into a violent screaming brawl. My father, Desmond, lunged forward. He threw his weight against Preston, desperately trying to pry the massive man off his youngest daughter. Desmond yelled for Preston to let her go, his voice cracking with a panicked desperation I had never heard before. My mother, Vivian, was shrieking hysterically. She beat her fists against Preston's broad shoulders, her expensive diamond ring snagging on his tailored suit jacket. She begged him to stop crying out that he was going to kill her. Preston did not even blink. The veins in his neck were bulging and his eyes were wild with pure, humiliated rage. He easily shoved Vivian backwards, sending her crashing onto the leather sofa. Marcus finally decided to stop cowering in the corner. He realized that if Chloe died, his $5 million meal ticket died with her. He rushed forward and grabbed Preston's arm, trying to pull him away. He told Preston to calm down and back off. It was the biggest mistake Marcus could have made. Preston released his grip on Chloe with one hand and pivoted his entire body. He swung a brutal, tightly coiled fist backward. The punch connected squarely with Marcus' jaw. The sickening crack of bone hitting bone echoed through the study. Marcus crumpled instantly. He fell backward, tripping over the edge of the antique coffee table and crashing hard onto the Persian rug. He lay there groaning and spitting blood onto the floor. Chloe gasped for air, sliding down the bookshelf until she hit the floor. She clutched her bruised throat, coughing violently and sobbing. Preston stood over her, breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he looked down at the woman he had married. He did not look at her with an ounce of love or even regret. He looked at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The mask of the charming old money elite completely slipped off his face. The polite progressive son-in-law they had paraded around the country club for years was gone. In his place stood a man who finally let his deep-seated racism and opportunistic greed bleed out into the open. Preston pointed a trembling finger down at my sister. He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made my mother's sobbing freeze in her throat. He asked Chloe if she honestly believed he had married her for love. The sheer venom in his voice was terrifying. He told her she was completely delusional. He paced across the room, turning his wrath on my parents as well. He looked directly at Desmond and Vivian and unleashed the ugly truth he had been hiding behind his polite country club smile. He told them he married into this family because having a beautiful black elite wife was the perfect diversity shield for his money laundering operations. He shouted that corporate auditors and federal regulators never looked twice at his shady hedge fund because he plastered his wealthy, successful black-in-laws all over his company brochures. He told Chloe she was nothing but a convenient prop. A highly educated, well-dressed mannequin, he used to prove how progressive and inclusive his brand was. He sneered at my parents, telling them they were absolutely pathetic for practically worshipping the ground he walked on just because he came from a long line of rich white bankers. He said they were so desperate for white elite validation that they blindly handed over their entire financial portfolio without asking a single intelligent question. He stepped closer to Desmond, pointing a finger right into my father's chest. He screamed that they were nothing but a convenient automated teller machine to him. He said the only reason he tolerated their pretentious Thanksgiving dinners and their boring charity galas was because he needed their pristine credit scores to keep his failing businesses afloat. He told them he despised every single one of them. The impact of his words hit my parents harder than any physical blow ever could. I watched the absolute horror wash over Vivian and Desmond's faces. Their entire social identity was built on Preston validating them. They had sacrificed their own daughter. They had abandoned me when I dropped out of law school, all because I did not fit into the perfect picture they were trying to paint for people exactly like Preston. They had tolerated his subtle microaggressions for years, always making excuses for him because he represented the pinnacle of high society. Now they had to stand there and listen to him admit that he viewed them as nothing more than foolish targets to be exploited. Vivian's face crumbled. The arrogant matriarch who had slapped me across the face just moments ago now looked small and completely broken. She looked at her golden child Chloe, who was still weeping on the floor, and then she looked at the man who had just admitted to using their race and their wealth as a shield for federal crimes. The reality of their catastrophic failure was finally setting in. But the humiliation was not over. Desmond stepped forward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The proud, unyielding patriarch of our family looked absolutely terrified. He did not defend his daughter's honor. He did not punch Preston for insulting his wife and his heritage. Instead, Desmond did the most pathetic thing imaginable. He begged. My father grabbed Preston's arm, his voice trembling with sheer panic. He pleaded with Preston to calm down and think about what he was saying. Desmond looked around the room, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. He admitted the darkest secret of all. He confessed that he and Vivian had co-signed all of Preston's massive corporate loans. Desmond's voice cracked as he yelled that if Preston went down for fraud, the bank would come after them. He grabbed Preston's lapels and screamed that if the hedge fund collapsed, they would lose this $20 million estate. He said they would lose their primary home in Atlanta. They would lose absolutely everything. Desmond was on his knees, clutching the fabric of Preston's ruined suit jacket. His voice was completely shattered as he confessed the ultimate financial sin. He and Vivian had blindly co-signed every single one of Preston's corporate loans. They had leveraged the entire Marthas Vineyard estate, the primary mansion in Atlanta, and every liquid asset they possessed just to keep Preston's fraudulent hedge fund afloat. Preston shoved my father away with absolute disgust, leaving the proud patriarch stumbling backward until he hit the edge of the leather sofa. Chloe was crying on the floor, rubbing her bruised neck, while Vivian wailed about their ruined reputation. Marcus was bleeding onto the Persian rug, groaning in pain. They were completely consumed by their own spectacular self-destruction. I did not raise my voice to join the screaming match. I did not offer my parents an ounce of sympathy. I turned my back on the pathetic brawl and walked calmly across the room toward the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the marble fireplace. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor, a steady sound ignored by the bickering family behind me. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the small, encrypted flash drive I had loaded earlier at the safe house. I slid the metal drive into the side port of the television and picked up the remote control resting on the mantel. I switched the input source and waited for the screen to connect to the hidden digital files. The massive television screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the dark study with a harsh, bright light. The high-definition display was instantly flooded with a sprawling, complex web of financial data. I did not just have a few bank statements. I had the complete digital footprint of Preston's entire illegal operation. Massive financial spreadsheets filled with highlighted rows and columns popped up on the screen side by side with scanned copies of offshore wire transfers. I used the remote to maximize the central document, ensuring the text was large enough for everyone in the room to read clearly. It was a master ledger detailing every single fraudulent transaction Preston had executed over the past 4 years. The screen displayed the exact flow of stolen money moving from his unsuspecting investors directly into a series of untraceable shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. But the absolute most damning piece of evidence was not just Preston's money laundering. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of high-resolution scans of corporate guarantee documents. Right there at the bottom of every single page in crisp black ink was my father Desmond's unmistakable signature. I had cross-referenced every illegal wire transfer with the collateral documents my parents had blindly signed to prop up their arrogant white son-in-law. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. It detailed millions of dollars in federal financial crimes, completely tying my parents' elite legacy to a crumbling Ponzi scheme. The bright light from the television cast an eerie glow across the room, finally catching their attention. The screaming and crying abruptly stopped. The deafening silence that rushed back into the study was heavy and suffocating. Preston froze, his chest still heaving from the physical altercation with Chloe and Marcus. He turned his head slowly, his eyes widening in pure, absolute terror as he stared at the 80-inch screen. He recognized the spreadsheets immediately. He knew those files were supposed to be locked behind military-grade encryption on his private server. Chloe stopped rubbing her neck and stared at the television with her mouth hanging open. Vivian and Desmond looked at the undeniable proof of their impending financial ruin. The reality of the situation crashed down on them all at once. They looked away from the glowing screen and turned to stare at me. I was standing next to the fireplace, perfectly calm, holding the remote control like a weapon. The horror creeping across their faces was not just about the fact that they were caught. It was the crushing realization of how long I had known. They looked at the dates on the files, realizing I had possessed this devastating information for years. I had not just stumbled upon this yesterday. I had been quietly watching them dig their own graves year after year. While they mocked me at family dinners and called me a disappointment, I had been sitting in the shadows, meticulously archiving every single one of their felonies. I let them hang themselves with their own greed. The heavy silence was shattered by a sudden, desperate movement. Marcus scrambled up from the floor, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the expensive rug. He realized that if those files went to the authorities, his own stolen $5 million life insurance payout would be flagged in the resulting federal investigation. His fake death would be exposed, and he would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. Panic completely consumed his rational thought. Marcus let out a loud, desperate yell and lunged across the room, charging straight toward the fireplace to grab the flash drive from the television port. He thought he could destroy the evidence and save himself from total ruin. He was absolutely wrong. I did not flinch or scream. I simply took one calm, calculated step backward. The heavy mahogany doors of the study burst open with terrifying force. The 4 elite private military contractors from my security team flooded into the room, moving with lethal precision. They drew their high-voltage tasers and leveled them directly at Marcus' chest. The bright red targeting lasers painted dots across his shirt. Marcus froze mid-stride, his hands raised high in the air, completely paralyzed by the sudden threat. I looked him dead in the eyes and kept my voice dangerously soft. "Touch it, and you will die for real this time, Marcus." Marcus stood absolutely frozen, the red targeting lasers painting tiny glowing dots across his chest. He slowly lowered his hands and backed away from the television screen. The private military contractors did not blink or lower their weapons. They simply formed a highly trained barricade between the glowing evidence and the desperate ghost of my husband. I stepped out from behind my security detail and walked to the center of the room. The air was thick with the suffocating realization that I held the absolute power to dismantle their entire existence. I looked at the people who were supposed to be my family. I let my eyes slowly move from my trembling parents to my bruised sister, to her humiliated husband, and finally back to the man who had promised to love me until death. I kept my voice incredibly steady, letting the sheer weight of my words crush whatever defiance they had left. I told Marcus that for 5 long years, I woke up every single morning with a gaping hole in my chest. I reminded them all how I had stood in the pouring rain clutching our young son as we watched them lower a heavy mahogany casket into the ground. A casket that contained absolutely nothing but dirt and stones. I spoke about the countless nights I spent holding Jamal while he cried himself to sleep, believing his father had been ripped away by a cruel and tragic accident. I told them about the devastating guilt I carried, wondering if I could have done something differently to save him from sinking. I turned my gaze to Vivian and Desmond. I reminded them how they watched me suffer. They sat at my dining room table, offering empty prayers and fake tears, knowing perfectly well that the man I was mourning was actually hiding out in a luxury villa with their youngest daughter. They let a 12-year-old boy grow up fatherless, just so Chloe could avoid a public scandal. They let me drown in absolute grief just to protect Preston's crumbling financial empire. They chose their country club aesthetic over the mental and emotional survival of their own flesh and blood. I pointed at the glowing television screen displaying the massive offshore bank accounts and the forged corporate loans. I told them that every single tear I shed was directly funding their pathetic attempts to buy white old money validation. The sheer magnitude of my cold, unyielding rage finally broke through Vivian's arrogant facade. The reality of the federal crimes displayed on the 80-inch screen shattered the final remnants of her elite high society pride. My mother, the woman who had slapped me across the face less than an hour ago, suddenly collapsed. Vivian fell to her knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. Her designer dress pooled around her as she began to sob hysterically. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a raw, desperate wail of a woman watching her entire kingdom burn to the ground. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out with trembling fingers to grab the hem of my skirt. Vivian looked up at me with mascara streaming down her face. She begged me to take the flash drive out of the television. She pleaded with me to delete the files and make the nightmare go away. Her voice cracked as she screamed that we were blood. She cried out that I was her daughter, and that if I released this information to the authorities, I would completely destroy the family legacy. She sobbed that the country club would exile them, that the banks would seize the estate, and that they would be utterly ruined forever. She begged me to show a tiny shred of mercy for the sake of the family name. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an absolute failure. I looked at the mother who had called me an ugly dropout, and a bitter disappointment just because I refused to play her superficial games. I pulled my skirt out of her desperate grasp. I kept my voice dangerously soft, but razor sharp. I told her that she threw my legacy away the exact moment she chose a fraudulent white son-in-law over her own black daughter. I reminded her that she had demanded I respect Preston's heritage while completely disrespecting my humanity. I looked down at her tear-stained face and told her I was no longer her scapegoat. I told her I was her karma. Desmond tried to step forward to help his weeping wife, but my security contractors raised their weapons higher silently, warning him to stay exactly where he was. The room descended into a chaotic symphony of panicked breathing and muffled sobs. Preston was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that simply did not exist. Chloe was curled into a tight ball against the bookshelf, completely paralyzed by the impending doom. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the study. I opened the encrypted email application I had set up weeks ago. The files were already attached. The recipient addresses were already loaded. I looked at the collection of traitors standing in front of me, and I pressed send. I listened to the soft swoosh sound of the digital confirmation. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked right at Preston. I told him the email was officially sent. I announced that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division were now reading every single page of his financials. His fake elite empire was over. The money laundering scheme was finished. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. The finality of the sent email hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to drop. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before pure survival instinct kicked in. Preston scrambled backward, knocking over a small antique side table. The crystal lamp crashed to the floor, but he did not even flinch. His eyes were wide and manic, shifting rapidly as his brain calculated the exact amount of time he had before federal agents kicked down his doors. He turned to Chloe, his face contorted with panic, and screamed at her to get upstairs. He ordered her to pack only their passports and whatever loose cash she had in her designer vault. He yelled that they needed to get to the private airstrip immediately. He was already pulling out his phone, his thumbs moving frantically as he tried to transfer whatever remaining funds he had into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. He shouted that they had a 3-hour window to make it to a non-extradition country. He mentioned a safe house in Macau. He insisted that they could vanish before the sun rose over the eastern seaboard if they moved fast enough right now. Chloe was completely paralyzed, still sitting on the floor, rubbing her bruised neck. Preston grabbed her arm and yanked her upward, roaring at her to move, before they both spent the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I watched them scramble like rats trapped in a burning building. My mother was still weeping on the rug, and my father was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the reality that his precious legacy was turning to ash. Marcus was clutching his jaw, silently inching toward the back door. I adjusted the strap of my clutch and turned my back on the pathetic scene. I walked slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors of the study, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled the door open. I paused right at the threshold and looked over my shoulder. I told Preston I would not bother packing those bags if I were him. He froze, his hand still gripping Chloe's arm. I smiled softly and informed him that trying to flee the island tonight would be an absolute waste of his time. I pointed out the large bay windows, where dark, heavy clouds were already rolling in off the Atlantic. I explained that a massive coastal storm was about to hit Marthas Vineyard. The Aviation Authority had just grounded every single private jet and commercial flight leaving the isolated island. They were entirely stranded. I tilted my head and added that it was actually a blessing in disguise. After all, they absolutely would not want to miss the country club's highly anticipated annual summer gala tomorrow evening. Vivian gasped, looking up at me with tear-streaked makeup. She asked how I could possibly expect them to attend a high society gala when their entire world was collapsing. She begged me to just let them hide. I let go of the brass door handle and took one step back into the room. The temperature in the study seemed to plummet. I told my mother she did not have a choice. I laid out the rules of their new reality with absolute terrifying clarity. I told Preston that my private military contractors had established a strict perimeter around the entire estate. I whispered that if any of them tried to run, tried to charter a private boat, or even tried to sneak off the property in the trunk of a car, my men had clear orders to stop them using whatever physical force was necessary. I promised him that a pair of broken kneecaps would make the long walk into federal court very uncomfortable. I demanded that they all put on their expensive tuxedos and designer gowns tomorrow night. I ordered them to walk into that elite ballroom and smile for the cameras. They were going to play the part of the perfect, flawless, wealthy family one last time. If they tried to run or if they failed to smile, I would not wait for the federal agents to arrive. I told Chloe that if they deviated from my script for even 1 second, I would immediately leak the high-definition video of her and my husband on that yacht to every major news outlet and social blog in the country. They would be public pariahs before the sun even came up. The threat of total immediate social annihilation was the only thing powerful enough to make my mother and sisters submit. Vivian covered her face and sobbed, realizing she would have to parade around her elite friends, knowing it was all a lie. Chloe looked like she was going to be physically sick. Preston just stared at me, his chest heaving, trapped by a woman he had spent years dismissing as completely irrelevant. He finally realized that the old money white privilege he had wielded like a weapon his entire life was completely useless against me. I had cut off every single exit. I had taken his money, his freedom, and his pride. Marcus slumped against the wall, knowing his second life was officially over. I looked at the 5 of them, a collection of liars, thieves, and cowards perfectly contained inside their own $20 million prison. I told them to get a good night of sleep because tomorrow was going to be an incredibly long day. I stepped out of the study and into the grand hallway. I grabbed the handles of the heavy mahogany doors and pulled them shut with a massive echoing slam. The sound reverberated through the empty corridors of the mansion, finalizing their captivity. I walked out the front door and into the cool, salty night air, breathing freely for the first time in 5 years. They were locked in a cage of their own making, waiting for the morning light to bring their ultimate destruction. The next evening arrived with the heavy, oppressive humidity typical of a looming coastal storm. Outside, the wind was beginning to whip through the trees, and the dark ocean churned violently against the shoreline. But inside the ultra-exclusive walls of the country club, the atmosphere was entirely different. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking display of unimaginable wealth and absolute social power. Crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceilings cast a warm, golden glow over the massive room. A live jazz band played smooth, elegant melodies from a raised velvet stage. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided effortlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with top-tier champagne and imported caviar. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society. And right in the center of this opulent illusion was my family playing their parts exactly as I had commanded. Vivian and Desmond were stationed near the grand staircase. They were forcing bright, wide smiles as they shook hands with powerful state senators and visiting tech moguls. Vivian wore a stunning emerald green designer gown, but if you looked closely, her hands were trembling so violently she had to grip her sequined clutch with both hands just to keep it steady. Desmond laughed loudly at a joke made by a wealthy real estate developer, but the sound was completely hollow and strained. They were absolutely terrified. They knew that my email to the federal authorities was already in motion. They knew their entire empire was currently being dismantled by cyber divisions, but they were too paralyzed by my threat to run. They were trapped performing for the very people they were about to lose forever. Across the room, Preston and Chloe were putting on the most agonizing performance of their lives. They stood near a massive swan ice sculpture, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were bone white. Preston looked physically sick. His normally pristine complexion was a sickly shade of gray, and beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. A prominent venture capitalist approached them asking Preston about the quarterly returns on his hedge fund. I watched from a hidden vantage point as Preston stammered out a pathetic excuse about market fluctuations. He kept looking over his shoulder, jumping every time a waiter dropped a glass or a door swung open. He knew his fake hedge fund was collapsing right under his feet, and the very investors he was lying to were about to discover he had stolen their life savings. Chloe stood frozen beside him, looking like a fragile porcelain doll, completely stripped of her usual arrogant swagger. She wore a custom silk dress, but she looked miserable wearing it. She kept scanning the crowd, searching for any sign of me. She was terrified that her disgusting secret was about to be broadcast to her entire social circle. She knew that if she stopped smiling for even 1 second, I would destroy her reputation permanently. Meanwhile, Marcus was nowhere near the main floor. The ghost was hiding out in the dimly lit VIP lounge on the second floor overlooking the ballroom. He was sitting alone in a dark leather booth, drinking heavy pours of scotch directly from the bottle. He could not risk mingling with the crowd since he was still supposed to be a dead man to the general public. He was trapped in the shadows, staring down at the elite gathering through the tinted glass. He was watching the luxurious life he had faked his own death to steal slowly slip completely through his fingers. He had traded his family for money, and now he was going to lose both. The smooth jazz music swelled and then gracefully faded out as the club president stepped up to the main microphone on the stage. He was an older, distinguished white billionaire who commanded instant respect from everyone in the room. The guests quieted down their conversations, turning to hushed whispers as they turned their attention toward the front of the ballroom. The president tapped the microphone and warmly welcomed the elite crowd to the highly anticipated annual summer gala. He spoke eloquently about tradition, legacy, and the importance of community leadership. Then he announced the absolute highlight of the evening. He said it was time to present the highly coveted Family of the Year award. He launched into a glowing speech about Vivian and Desmond. He praised their flawless lineage, their remarkable philanthropy, and their seamless integration into Preston's historic old money family. He called them a shining beacon of excellence and a true testament to the power of high society values. The sheer irony of his words was staggering. He was praising the integrity of a family that was currently drowning in federal fraud and deep moral corruption. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vivian and Desmond plastered on their fake smiles and began the long, agonizing walk up to the stage. Every step they took must have felt like walking toward a firing squad. They climbed the carpeted stairs and graciously accepted the heavy crystal trophy from the president. The audience clapped louder, completely unaware of the monstrous reality hiding behind the smiles of the award winners. Vivian stepped right up to the podium, gripping the edges of the wooden stand to support her shaking legs. She looked out at the sea of wealthy, powerful faces. These were the people she had sacrificed her own daughter to impress. These were the people whose validation she craved more than oxygen. She leaned into the microphone, preparing to deliver her perfectly rehearsed, boastful speech about her flawless family and their unmatched success. She opened her mouth to speak her first lie of the evening, but the words never came out. Before Vivian could utter a single syllable, the massive mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom burst open with a deafening, violent crash. The heavy doors slammed against the walls, echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. The jazz band immediately stopped playing mid-note. The waiters froze in place, their silver trays hovering in the air. Every single elite guest in the room turned their heads in absolute shock to look at the entrance. I stood perfectly still, framed by the massive arched doorway of the grand ballroom. The sudden silence in the room was absolute and incredibly heavy. Hundreds of eyes stared at me, trying to process the visual shock of my arrival. I was not wearing the modest, cheap clothing my family always mocked. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-designed blood-red silk gown. The fabric cascaded down my body like liquid fire, trailing elegantly across the polished marble floor. I held my head high, radiating the kind of untouchable power that money alone could never buy. I held my 12-year-old son Jamal's hand firmly in my right hand. He was dressed in a sharp-tailored black tuxedo, looking completely unbothered by the hundreds of wealthy strangers staring at us. He stood tall right beside me, knowing exactly how safe and protected he was. But the absolute masterpiece of my entrance was the man standing to my left. I rested my hand lightly on the arm of a powerful, elderly white billionaire. His name was Arthur Vance. He was a legendary titan in the financial sector, known for his ruthless business acquisitions and zero tolerance for corporate fraud. More importantly, Arthur Vance was the primary investor in Preston's failing hedge fund and the single largest creditor holding the debt for Preston's so-called old money family trust. He wore a classic bespoke tuxedo and exuded an aura of total, absolute dominance. He had gladly accepted my invitation to escort me tonight after I provided his forensic accounting team with the undeniable proof of Preston's massive money laundering operation. He wanted a front-row seat to the execution. The reaction from the stage was instantaneous and spectacular. My mother, Vivian, stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The color completely drained from her carefully contoured face, making her look pale and entirely hollow. She recognized the blood-red gown I was wearing. It was the exact designer piece she had admired in a luxury magazine just last week, complaining that the waiting list was impossible to crack. My father, Desmond, gripped the heavy Crystal Family of the Year trophy so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked like he was going to pass out right there on the raised velvet stage. Across the room, I saw Preston and Chloe standing frozen near the massive swan ice sculpture. Preston's reaction was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. He did not even look at me. His panicked eyes were entirely locked on Arthur Vance. Preston began to hyperventilate. He stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter and knocking a tray of expensive champagne glasses to the floor. The glass shattered loudly, but Preston did not even blink. He knew exactly who Arthur Vance was, and he knew exactly what his presence meant. The fake financial empire Preston had built using his white privilege and my parents' money was completely over. Chloe grabbed his arm, looking frantic and confused, but Preston just kept staring at the elderly billionaire with pure, unadulterated dread. Up on the stage, Vivian finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The sheer humiliation of having her estranged dropout daughter ruin her perfect high society moment pushed her into absolute panic. She leaned desperately into the microphone on the wooden podium. Her voice echoed sharply across the silent ballroom, completely stripping away her refined, elegant persona. She shrieked into the microphone, demanding that the event security remove me from the premises immediately. She yelled that I was not a member of the elite country club and that I was an unstable intruder trying to ruin a private gathering. She pointed a trembling finger at me, ordering the guards to drag me out by force if necessary. Two massive security guards stationed near the entrance immediately stepped forward. They placed their hands on their radios and began walking briskly toward me, looking entirely ready to grab my arms and physically throw me out of the building. Jamal squeezed my hand slightly, but I gave his fingers a gentle, reassuring pulse. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I just stood there, perfectly calm. As the guards closed the distance, Arthur Vance simply stopped walking. The powerful billionaire did not shout or make a dramatic scene. He looked directly at the two approaching security guards and slowly raised one single index finger in the air. That was all it took. The gesture was so incredibly subtle, but it carried the weight of absolute supreme authority. The two massive guards stopped dead in their tracks. They looked at Arthur Vance, recognizing the man who essentially funded the entire operational budget of the country club. Their faces paled in unison. They immediately took their hands off their radios and took 3 quick, respectful steps backward, bowing their heads slightly in submission. They completely ignored my mother's frantic screaming from the stage. Vivian watched her command fail spectacularly. She gripped the edges of the podium, looking around the ballroom for anyone to help her. But the wealthy guests were all staring at Arthur Vance, whispering frantically to one another, trying to figure out why a legendary financial titan was personally escorting the disgraced daughter of the Williams family. They could sense the massive power shift happening right in front of their eyes. Arthur Vance turned to me and offered a polite, respectful nod. He gently released my arm and told me the floor was entirely mine. I thanked him quietly and let go of Jamal's hand, telling him to stay right there next to Mr. Vance. I stepped away from the doorway and began my slow, deliberate walk across the grand ballroom. The crowd of elite socialites, senators, and tech moguls automatically parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for me to walk through. I did not look at any of them. I kept my eyes locked directly on the stage where my mother was trembling uncontrollably. I reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs leading up to the stage. I climbed them with effortless grace, the heavy silk of my red gown trailing beautifully behind me. Desmond stepped back instinctively, clutching the useless crystal trophy to his chest. Vivian stood frozen behind the wooden podium, her breathing fast and ragged. I walked right up to her, invading her personal space the exact way she had invaded mine on the airport tarmac just 1 day ago. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and took the microphone right out of her shaking hand. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy, powerful people in the room, ready to deliver the final killing blow. I tapped the cold metal of the microphone twice. The sharp tapping sound echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting through the thick, uncomfortable silence. I looked out at the sea of wealthy, elite faces staring back at me. I cleared my throat and offered a polite but completely chilling smile. I said good evening to the distinguished guests and the esteemed members of the country club. I pointed toward my mother Vivian, who was still trembling beside the wooden podium. I told the crowd that my mother was absolutely right when she told the security guards to remove me. I announced clearly that I was not a member of this exclusive high society club. I let that statement hang in the air for a moment, watching the smug expressions return to the faces of some of the older conservative guests. They thought I was finally admitting defeat. They thought I was just a bitter, estranged daughter crashing a private party to ruin a family celebration. They had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. I gripped the microphone tighter and took a slow, deliberate breath. I told the audience that while I was not a member, I did have a very specific relationship with this prestigious institution. I explained that over the past 4 years, my private wealth management firm, Apex Holdings, had been aggressively acquiring commercial real estate portfolios across the eastern seaboard. I watched the confusion ripple through the crowd as I transitioned from a family dispute into a corporate takeover speech. I locked eyes with the wealthy club president, who was standing near the front row. I told him that my firm had quietly bought out 80% of the massive commercial debt holding this historic country club together. I raised my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the room heard my next sentence perfectly. I declared that I was not a member because I was their absolute landlord. I told them I owned the very ground they were standing on and the massive roof over their heads. The entire ballroom erupted into an immediate, deafening uproar. Shocked gasps and loud, panicked whispers filled the opulent space. Wealthy socialites dropped their jaws in absolute disbelief. Powerful state senators turned to their aides, demanding to know if my claims were legally possible. The perfect, elegant atmosphere of the summer gala completely shattered into pieces. People were shoving past each other, trying to get a better look at me. My father, Desmond, slumped against the stage wall, his face entirely devoid of color. He finally realized that the daughter he discarded had just conquered his entire social universe. My mother covered her face with her trembling hands, completely unable to look at the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive voice sliced through the chaotic noise of the massive crowd. Preston shoved his way to the front of the stage, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs. He yelled to the crowd that I was completely lying to them. He desperately tried to protect his crumbling white privilege and his fake old money status. He shouted that the commercial debt for the country club was exclusively owned by his historic family trust. He pleaded with the elite guests not to believe a single word coming from a mentally unstable dropout. He swore that his wealthy ancestors had secured the land rights decades ago and that a black woman like me could never possibly afford to buy them out. He was practically foaming at the mouth, terrified that his ultimate financial shield was being ripped away in public view. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to match his pathetic screaming. I simply looked at him with absolute pity. I turned my attention away from Preston and looked up toward the audiovisual booth located on the second-floor balcony. I gave a swift, sharp nod to the technician running the event equipment. The technician was one of my undercover contractors who had infiltrated the event staff earlier that afternoon. The massive projector screens mounted behind the velvet stage were supposed to display a heartwarming slideshow of my parents celebrating their fake perfect lineage. Instead, the bright screens flickered and went entirely black for a fraction of a second, causing the room to hush in eager anticipation of my next deliberate move. When the screens illuminated again, they did not show happy family photographs. They displayed high-resolution scans of federal legal documents. I turned back to the microphone and instructed the crowd to look at the massive screens behind me. I told Preston that his precious family trust had gone completely bankrupt 2 years ago. I explained that his father had secretly sold off all their remaining assets to avoid going to federal prison. I pointed to the screens displaying the official foreclosure deeds and the transfer of ownership certificates. The documents clearly showed that Apex Holdings had purchased the defaulted loans directly from the national banks for pennies on the dollar. Every single authorized signature and verified federal stamp was projected in massive, unarguable detail. The undeniable proof of his complete financial ruin was broadcast 50 feet high for every single member of high society to read. The elite crowd stared at the evidence, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the absolute destruction unfolding right before their very eyes. They finally understood that the arrogant man who had been parading around their club was nothing more than a spectacular fraud. My victory was absolutely undeniable and completely final. The entire room remained completely breathless as the crushing weight of the truth settled over them all. I stood tall under the crystal chandeliers, knowing my revenge was complete. I had dismantled his empire. I owned this club. I simply smiled because I won everything. I turned my attention away from the massive projector screens and looked directly down at Preston and Chloe. They were standing completely frozen at the base of the velvet stage. The arrogant smirk Preston had worn for years was entirely gone. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the trap I had built. I leaned into the microphone and let my voice ring out with absolute supreme authority. I told Preston that his historic family trust had gone completely bankrupt 2 full years ago. I explained to the breathless crowd that his father had quietly liquidated every remaining asset to avoid federal charges, leaving his precious white elite legacy entirely empty. I told the room that Apex Holdings had swooped in and purchased his toxic bad debt straight from the desperate creditors. I looked right at Preston and told him that the sprawling $20 million mansion he currently lived in was not a generational family heirloom. It was currently leased directly from my corporate holding company. I smiled a slow, cold smile and added that the silver Aston Martin he drove to the gala tonight was officially registered to a corporate luxury fleet that I personally owned. He was a tenant living in my house and driving my car. Then I turned my piercing gaze to my younger sister. Chloe was shaking uncontrollably, clutching her husband's arm as if his crumbling strength could somehow save her from public annihilation. I looked her up and down, taking in her immaculate, expensive appearance. I told her that even the custom silk Vera Wang dress she was wearing tonight was bought with a black credit card that I now owned the debt to. I told her the flawless diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist was financed through a boutique private bank that my firm had aggressively acquired last quarter. I let my words slice through her fragile ego. I told her she was literally standing in my clothes, covered in my jewelry, pretending to be an untouchable billionaire socialite while having absolutely nothing to her own name. Chloe let out a pathetic, broken sob, covering her mouth as the surrounding guests began to whisper and point directly at her. She had spent her entire life judging my choices, and now she was exposed as nothing more than a heavily indebted fraud. But I was not finished. The complete financial ruin of my immediate family was just the beginning of the execution. I raised my head and addressed the entire opulent ballroom. I looked at the powerful state senators, the tech moguls, and the retired corporate executives who had blindly trusted Preston with their massive fortunes. I told them to look very closely at the complex spreadsheets still glowing brightly on the massive screens behind me. I explained that Preston had not just lied about his old money heritage to impress my foolish parents. He had actively stolen from every single person standing in this room. I systematically broke down his fraudulent hedge fund operation. I detailed exactly how he had taken their massive retirement accounts and funneled the liquid cash into untraceable offshore shell companies to cover his own catastrophic market losses. I told the elite crowd that their lucrative real estate investments did not exist. The high-yield financial returns he had been promising them in his monthly newsletters were completely fabricated. Preston had used their hard-earned money to fund a massive illegal Ponzi scheme, and the vault was now completely empty. The reaction from the audience was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying. The polite, wealthy guests completely dropped their high society manners in the blink of an eye. The room descended into absolute chaos. A prominent venture capitalist surged forward, screaming at Preston, demanding to know where his $10 million initial investment had gone. Several other furious executives joined him, their faces flushed with violent red rage. They formed a tight, aggressive circle around Preston and Chloe, shouting and grabbing violently at his tailored tuxedo jacket. Preston tried to back away, raising his trembling hands in a desperate plea for calm, but the angry mob of defrauded elites showed zero mercy. My parents, Vivian and Desmond, backed away from the stage, trying to physically distance themselves from their disgraced son-in-law, but the crowd turned on them too. The furious guests shouted that my parents were complicit, demanding they be held fully accountable for providing Preston with a false shield of respectability. As the physical altercation escalated, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom remained firmly shut, trapping them inside. The chaotic shouting inside the opulent hall was suddenly pierced by a sharp, deafening sound coming from outside the estate. I stepped back from the wooden podium and listened as the distinct wail of federal sirens cut violently through the humid night air. The piercing sound grew louder and more aggressive, multiplying as dozens of vehicles raced up the long, winding gravel driveway of the isolated country club. The angry mob inside the ballroom froze mid-shout, turning their heads in unison toward the massive stained glass windows lining the eastern wall. The vibrant stained glass designs depicting peaceful aristocratic scenes were suddenly illuminated by violent rapid flashes of bright red and blue lights. The emergency lights swept erratically across the darkened room, casting long, terrifying shadows over the pale faces of the elite guests. The sheer number of sirens confirmed it was not just local police responding to a noise complaint. It was a massive, coordinated federal raid. The horrifying realization hit the crowd like a massive tidal wave. The wealthy socialites who had been screaming at Preston just moments ago suddenly realized they were about to be caught right in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. The elegant, sophisticated summer gathering instantly devolved into a desperate, panicked stampede as people began shoving each other and trampling over delicate silk gowns. I stood and smiled watching them burn. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom burst open violently as 24 heavily armed federal agents flooded the room. The chaos was absolute and deafening. Men in dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI stamped across their backs moved with terrifying military precision, securing all the exits over the panicked screams of fleeing socialites. Up in the VIP lounge, Marcus finally realized his borrowed time had officially run out. The ghost who spent 5 years hiding in the shadows panicked like a cornered rat. He abandoned his expensive scotch and bolted for the service stairs, hoping to slip out through the kitchen loading dock before agents could secure the perimeter. I watched from the stage as he sprinted wildly through the swinging silver doors of the culinary prep area, shoving terrified waiters out of his way and slipping on the polished commercial tiles. He thought he was smart enough to outrun a federal raid, but he was entirely wrong. Just as he reached the heavy metal exit doors leading to the delivery alley, they flew open with explosive force. A tactical team of marshals breached the kitchen with weapons drawn. Marcus tried to pivot back toward the dining room, but an agent twice his size launched forward and tackled him straight around the waist. The sheer momentum sent both men crashing brutally into a towering cart of multi-tiered dessert cakes prepped for the gala. Marcus hit the ground hard, buried under a mountain of crushed fondant vanilla icing and shattered silver platters. The agents pinned him to the slippery tile, ripping his arms behind his back and tightly securing steel handcuffs around his wrists. His second life was officially over. Back in the main ballroom, the scene was even more spectacular. Preston was completely surrounded by the angry mob of defrauded investors when federal agents zeroed in on him. He tried to raise his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, but the agents showed zero mercy for the arrogant white money launderer. They grabbed him by the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo and violently slammed him face first onto a long banquet table. Crystal champagne flutes and silver trays of imported caviar went flying in every direction, clattering against the marble floor. Preston gasped for air as an agent pressed a knee hard into his spine, wrenching his arms backward to apply the handcuffs. The cold metallic click of the cuffs echoed like music to my ears. Preston began to thrash and scream, abandoning his polished aristocratic persona. He turned his head wildly, looking for my sister. He spotted Chloe cowering near the melting ice swan and screamed at the top of his lungs. He shouted to the federal agents that she was the one responsible for the missing millions. He yelled that his black elite wife masterminded the entire offshore strategy, and he was just an innocent victim of her greedy manipulation. He threw the woman he married straight under the bus without a single second of hesitation. But his desperate lies did not save him. The powerful old money-white elites who previously embraced Preston as their golden boy now looked down at him with unadulterated disgust. The legendary billionaire Arthur Vance stood near the front, holding my son, Jamal's hand, keeping him safe from the commotion. Arthur Vance looked at Preston struggling on the table and openly spat right at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He loudly declared Preston a disgrace to their heritage and permanently banished him from high society. Preston lost his wealth, his freedom, and his prized racial superiority all in the span of 5 minutes. The total destruction of my enemies was unfolding perfectly, but the most pathetic display of the night was happening right at my feet. My mother Vivian watched the agents drag her prestigious son-in-law toward the exit doors. She watched the elite guests stepping away from her family as if they carried a highly contagious disease. The pristine country club image she worshipped her entire life was burning to the ground right in front of her perfectly contoured face. Her breathing became shallow and frantic. The heavy crystal Family of the Year trophy slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the hardwood floor of the velvet stage and shattering into 100 jagged, sparkling pieces. Vivian did not look at the broken glass. Her knees completely buckled underneath her, giving out as the crushing weight of imminent ruin broke her spine. She collapsed onto the stage right in front of me, her beautiful emerald green designer gown pooling awkwardly around her legs. She was no longer the arrogant matriarch who had slapped me across the face yesterday afternoon. She was a broken, terrified woman facing the absolute end of her luxurious existence. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp shards of broken crystal biting into her skin. She reached out with shaking, desperate hands and tightly grabbed the hem of my breathtaking, blood-red silk gown. She looked up at me, with mascara running down her cheeks, and her flawless makeup completely ruined by hysterical sobbing. She wailed at the top of her lungs, begging me to save them. She cried out that we were blood. She shrieked that she was my mother and pleaded with me to use my massive wealth and power to stop the federal agents from taking everything they owned. I stood perfectly still on the raised velvet stage, looking down at the weeping woman clutching the bottom of my dress. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a single tissue or a comforting word. I looked at Vivian with eyes as cold and deep as the midnight ocean. There was not a single ounce of pity anywhere in my soul for the people who had gladly watched me suffer for 5 agonizing years. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her desperate fingers off my expensive silk fabric, dropping her hands back onto the shattered crystal. I turned away from her sobbing face and stepped right back up to the wooden podium. I gripped the sides of the stand and leaned in extremely close to the live microphone, ensuring my voice would boom across the chaotic ballroom, loud enough for every single federal agent and wealthy elite to hear my final verdict. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and leaned into the microphone. The harsh screech of feedback pierced the air, instantly silencing the remaining whispers in the grand ballroom. I looked down at my mother, who was still kneeling on the shattered remains of her precious crystal trophy. Her hands were covered in tiny cuts from the broken glass, and her emerald gown was ruined, but I felt absolutely nothing for her. I pitched my voice low and steady, letting every single syllable carry the heavy weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. I told Vivian that people like her always hide behind the concept of blood when it is convenient to demand salvation. I said blood makes you related, but loyalty is what actually makes you family. I reminded her that for 5 years, she gladly sacrificed my sanity and my son's future just to maintain her flawless high society facade. I looked at Desmond, who was staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I told them both that they actively chose their country club aesthetic over the well-being of their own daughter. I leaned closer to the microphone and smiled a cold, hollow smile. I told them to enjoy that perfect aesthetic in federal court. My mother let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She tried to reach for me again, but her arms fell limp at her sides. She knew the social execution was complete, but the financial execution was just beginning. I stood tall and addressed my parents one last time, ensuring the federal agents securing the room could hear every single detail. I reminded Desmond about the mountain of corporate loans he had so eagerly co-signed to prop up Preston's fraudulent hedge fund. I watched my father's face drain of whatever little color he had left. I informed them that because they used their sprawling $20 million Marthas Vineyard estate as direct collateral for those illegal loans, the property was no longer theirs. I explained that as part of the massive federal investigation unfolding tonight, their beloved summer mansion had already been officially seized by the United States government. The luxurious home they had used to look down on the rest of the world was now federal property. I told them they had exactly until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to pack their personal clothing and permanently vacate the premises. I added a final crushing warning, telling Vivian not to bother trying to pack the antique family silver because the asset forfeiture team was already at the house cataloging it. Desmond fell to his knees right beside my mother, completely broken by the absolute reality that his wealth, his home, and his freedom were entirely gone. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had constantly belittled my business ventures was now officially homeless and facing severe criminal conspiracy charges. The surrounding crowd of old money elites did not offer them a single glance of pity. The people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress were now actively pointing fingers at them, whispering about their massive disgrace. The complete dismantling of their fraudulent empire was an absolute masterpiece to witness. I stepped away from the wooden podium, leaving the microphone behind. I walked gracefully down the carpeted stairs of the velvet stage, my blood-red silk gown gliding seamlessly across the polished floor. I moved through the chaotic scene with absolute calm. Federal agents were actively dragging a kicking and screaming Preston out the main doors, while Chloe sat weeping uncontrollably in the corner, entirely ignored by the very people she used to rule over. I walked straight toward the front of the ballroom, where the legendary billionaire Arthur Vance was standing securely with my son. Jamal looked up at me with profound respect, completely untouched by the madness surrounding us. I thanked Arthur Vance for his time and his powerful presence. The elderly billionaire offered me a deep, respectful bow, acknowledging that the so-called ugly dropout had just executed the most brilliant corporate and social takeover in the history of Atlanta high society. I took Jamal's hand in mine and turned toward the grand exit. As we began to walk, the massive crowd of terrified wealthy elites instinctively backed away. They scrambled to clear a wide-open path for me, their eyes wide with absolute awe and pure terror. The same people who had sneered at me earlier in the evening now held their breath as I passed, recognizing the untouchable power I now wielded. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a queen leaving her conquered territory. The flashing red and blue emergency lights from the federal vehicles outside cast dramatic shadows across the marble foyer, but I did not look back at the wreckage. I left my abusers to face the absolute wrath of the federal government. I watched for a brief, satisfying moment as agents hauled Marcus out the side door, his face bruised and his fake identity entirely shattered. The ghost was finally going to a real prison. I left them drowning in the very deception they had created to destroy me. The heavy glass doors of the country club opened for me, and I stepped out into the cool, turbulent night air. The storm I had promised them was finally breaking violently over the island. The winds howled, and the heavy rain washed away the last traces of their elite illusion. We climbed into my waiting armored vehicle and drove away from the flashing sirens, leaving the nightmare entirely behind us. The dark, turbulent night slowly faded, giving way to the quiet, inevitable passage of time. The storm raged for hours, purging the island of its toxic secrets before finally exhausting itself. The very next morning, the heavy clouds finally broke apart, revealing a clear, pristine sky. The bright golden sun rose slowly over the serene coastal waters of Marthas Vineyard, bringing the dawn of a completely new era. The sun rose over Martha's Vineyard, casting a cold, pale light across the island. The storm had passed, leaving a crisp, cloudless sky, but the destruction left in its wake was absolute. At exactly 8 in the morning, black federal vehicles surrounded the sprawling $20 million estate my parents called their kingdom. The manicured lawns were trampled by dozens of agents wearing dark windbreakers. They marched in and out of the massive mahogany doors, carrying boxes filled with financial records, encrypted hard drives, and stolen assets. The seizure was entirely methodical and completely ruthless. Every piece of luxury my family illegally acquired was tagged and confiscated by the United States government. I watched the live security feed from the cameras my contractors had hidden around the perimeter. The high-angle view displayed the pathetic remains of my former family. My father, Desmond, stood near the front gate, looking completely hollowed out. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his wrinkled tuxedo pants. He watched helplessly as federal agents carried his expensive art collection out to a transport truck. My mother, Vivian, was nowhere to be seen. The humiliation of being evicted in broad daylight in front of the wealthy neighborhood forced her to hide in the back of whatever rental car they managed to secure. Their flawless high society image was officially dead and buried. But the most tragic sight of all was my younger sister. Chloe was sitting right on the cold concrete curb at the end of the long gravel driveway. The glamorous golden child, who spent her entire life looking down on me, was reduced to an absolute shell of a woman. Her custom silk designer gown was stained with mud and completely ruined from the storm. She was shivering violently, pulling the torn fabric tightly around her shoulders to block the chilly morning breeze. Her expensive blowout was matted against her face, and her perfect makeup was heavily smeared across her cheeks from hours of hysterical crying. She was sitting completely alone. Her arrogant white husband Preston was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades of prison time. The old money family she married into completely disowned her the second the handcuffs clicked around Preston's wrists. She had absolutely nothing left to her name. No money, no husband, no status, and no future. I turned away from the security feed and looked out the window of my private jet. We were currently cruising at 30,000 feet, heading straight toward New York. The cabin of the aircraft was bathed in warm golden sunlight, a perfect contrast to the cold, miserable morning my family was experiencing down on the ground. I leaned back into my plush leather seat and took a slow sip of my vintage champagne. The quiet hum of the jet engines was incredibly peaceful. My security team handled the extraction perfectly, ensuring Jamal and I boarded the aircraft long before the media descended on the country club. Suddenly, the private cell phone resting on the polished walnut table next to me began to vibrate. I looked down at the bright screen and saw Chloe's name flashing. She must have begged one of the federal agents to let her make one phone call. I set my champagne glass down and tapped the screen, answering the call via the aircraft's secure Bluetooth system. "Nia, please, you have to help me." Chloe's voice echoed through the cabin speakers. She was sobbing so hard she could barely form a complete sentence. Her tone was raw and completely desperate, stripped of all the arrogance and cruel mockery she used against me for years. "Nia, my credit cards are all declining. The bank just froze my personal checking account, and the agents will not let me back into the house to get my jewelry. I have absolutely no cash and nowhere to go. Preston is gone. Mom and Dad are leaving me here. Please, Nia, I am begging you. You have to send a car for me. We are sisters. We are blood." I sat perfectly still, listening to the pathetic sound of her weeping. This was the same woman who kissed my husband on a yacht and laughed about me crying over an empty grave. This was the same sister who eagerly plotted to steal my inheritance and call me a mentally unstable failure just 24 hours ago. Now she was invoking the sacred bond of sisterhood because she was freezing on a concrete curb with zero options. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or vindictive. I spoke with the calm, absolute certainty of a woman who had completely reclaimed her power. I told her that she made her choice 5 years ago when she decided to trade my sanity for a $5 million payout. I looked out the window at the clear blue sky and delivered my final verdict. "Go find another table, Chloe. This one is for family." I reached forward and ended the call, cutting off her desperate crying instantly. I picked up my phone and expertly popped the small tray open. I pulled the tiny plastic SIM card out of the device. I held it between my fingers for a brief second before dropping it directly into my glass of champagne. I watched the small chip sink to the bottom of the bubbling golden liquid, permanently severing my connection to the toxic people who tried to destroy me. I turned my head and looked across the luxurious cabin. Jamal was sitting in the oversized seat opposite me, wearing a comfortable sweater and completely engrossed in a new video game on his tablet. He was smiling softly, completely unaware of the absolute destruction taking place miles below us. He was entirely safe, perfectly secure, and infinitely loved. I took a deep, calming breath and smiled warmly back at him, knowing our beautiful new life had finally begun today. Exactly 1 month passed since the violent storm washed away the fake elite empire of Marthas Vineyard. I stood on the sprawling glass balcony of my massive Manhattan penthouse, looking out over the waking city. The morning sun bathed the entire skyline in a warm, triumphant golden light. The air was crisp and completely clear. I leaned against the polished railing, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the vibrant, chaotic energy of New York City wash over me. It was the absolute sound of ultimate freedom. The suffocating weight of my toxic family was permanently gone. The past 4 weeks had been an absolute masterclass in federal justice and public humiliation. The media descended on the country club scandal like starved wolves. Every major news network ran endless segments dissecting Preston's massive money laundering scheme, and the complete collapse of his old money white privilege. His so-called prestigious family cut him off instantly, leaving him to face decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely alone. Marcus was locked away in a cell right next to him, his fake identity completely shattered, and his stolen millions entirely seized by the government. Chloe was still couch surfing, relying on the charity of former sorority sisters who secretly despised her. She was a ghost in the very high society circles she used to rule, reduced to selling her leftover designer shoes online just to buy groceries. The country club itself was undergoing a massive transformation. As the majority debt holder, I fired the entire corrupt board of directors. Apex Holdings was currently restructuring the historic property into a premier corporate retreat for minority-owned technology startups and independent developers. The very grounds where my parents used to flaunt their exclusionary elitism were now going to be used to build genuine wealth for people who actually deserved it. The heavy sliding glass door behind me opened with a soft glide. I turned my head and watched Jamal walk out onto the sunlit terrace. He was holding his sleek silver tablet, his eyes scanning a new email that had just arrived from our property management division. He walked up to stand right beside me, leaning against the glass railing. He looked up at me with a sharp, knowing smile. He told me that my executive assistant just sent over the latest tenant reports for our real estate portfolio. He said Grandma and Grandpa had officially signed their new lease agreements. He announced that Vivian and Desmond were forced to move into one of the low-income apartment complexes I built down in Atlanta. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, looking out at the endless horizon. The people who had practically worshipped a fraudulent white son-in-law and sacrificed their own black daughter for country club status were now living in the exact same affordable housing units they used to mock me for developing. The poetic justice was absolutely flawless. I looked down at my son and offered a calm, gentle smile. I told him to contact the property management office immediately. I instructed him to make sure the managers did not charge his grandparents any late fees for their very first month of rent. I told him we needed to show them a tiny ounce of grace, because we certainly were not monsters. Jamal laughed softly and tapped the screen to send the email. He was growing into a brilliant, strong young man completely untouched by the toxic generational trauma that had poisoned my family for decades. I had successfully broken the cycle. I built a massive financial fortress, not just to destroy the people who betrayed me, but to ensure that my son would never have to beg for a seat at anyone else's table. We owned the entire room now. The elite circles that had rejected me were currently begging my investment firm for meetings. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and I held every single string. We did not need to pretend or perform for anybody ever again. I turned my attention back to the breathtaking city skyline. I thought about the terrified look on my mother's face when she fell to her knees on that shattered crystal. I thought about my father's empty stare as the federal agents carried his precious legacy out the front door in cardboard boxes. They had spent my entire life trying to force me into a perfect little box. They demanded I marry the right men, attend the right galas, and silence my own ambitions just to maintain their shallow aesthetic. When I refused to play their pathetic games, they labeled me a total failure. They called me an ugly dropout and a bitter disappointment. They thought they could discard me and hide my brilliant mind in the shadows. They genuinely believed that blood gave them the right to use me as a stepping stone for their own selfish desires. I looked directly forward, staring straight ahead, as if the entire world was watching me. I spoke with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had conquered her deepest fears and destroyed her greatest enemies. They told me I was a complete disappointment because I refused to fit into their picture-perfect country club frame. They abandoned me when I needed them most, and they eagerly buried me in their vicious lies. They threw dirt on my name and expected me to quietly suffocate under the heavy weight of their arrogance. But they forgot one fundamental, undeniable truth about seeds. When you bury a seed in the dark, it does not simply die. It uses the dirt to grow thick, aggressive roots. It feeds on the darkness until it becomes strong enough to push upward. And when it finally breaks through the surface, it completely tears the entire foundation apart.